Arts. Now, that brings up the question of how did we even come to choose this topic for this year's furniture seminar? Because for many of us, sorry to the friends among us, the Quaker legacy is elusive. The average American today, if they have to think about the word Quaker, it's the image on the screen that comes to mind. But if we go back in time, that is not the case at all. And in fact, much of the program is structured around the fact that if we were in British North America around 1700, we would actually be experiencing a world in which 3 of the 13 original colonies, Rhode Island, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, had dominant Quaker populations and factions that occupied the governorship, that commanded the majority of the colonial assembly, and were the largest, best organized religious community within 3 of the 13 original colonies. And we celebrate the fact that within that political framework, there was amazing craftsmanship with the work of the Goddards and the Townsends in Newport, with the work of Quaker cabinet makers like Thomas Affleck in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and Thomas White working in Perquimans County, North Carolina. How is it that this community that we think about so little in the modern landscape played such a big part of early American politics, early American religious life, and as we'll learn more this weekend, early American craftsmanship? And so just who were the society of people, as was said in the period vulgarly called Quakers, who became known as the Society of Friends and were known for their piety, their honesty, and their industriousness? And if you look at this image, you're looking at an early 19th century engraving of what was, in many ways, Quaker Central, the meeting on Grace Church Street in central London, in the heart of the financial district, a meeting that had been a powerhouse since the 18th century. And while we can look at this meeting and understand all it says about Quaker material life and culture, of looking at the clothing of the men and the women seated on opposite sides of the meeting house, the complete absence in the religious setting of an altar or a pulpit, but rather a congregation gathered as a community facing each other with the facing bench for the meeting's elders and lay ministers at the forefront. And how interesting to note that in terms of the history of this particular meeting in London, in the financial district, looking at these people gathered quietly in plain dress would have been members of, that would be the Barclay family of Barclays Bank. That would be the Lloyd family of Lloyds of London Insurance. That would be the Hanbury family, who were among the largest Chesapeake merchants throughout the 18th century, commanding ships going back and forth between Maryland, Virginia, the Carolinas, and London. So therefore, we have to go back and think about what are the roots of Quakerism, how George Fox was its founder, how William Penn became the person who brought an entire Quaker established colony of Pennsylvania to early America, and how a group of people came together around living dedicated to peace, equality, plainness, a sense of community. And when George Fox founded Quakerism in the 17th century, there was a sense that in addition to recreating the earliest manifestation of Christian life as sort of the Puritans within the Puritans, that if the Anglicans had rebelled against the Catholics and the Puritans had rebelled against the Anglicans, that now the Quakers were going to be this latest phase. And there was a period of time in which I think the earliest Quakers felt that maybe they would succeed in becoming the dominant faction within the Church of England and completely remake the faith from the bottom up. Over time, they realized that that was not going to happen. that they were probably going to be a minority community, but by adhering to these core principles of peace, equality, plainness, that they would be a community that could lead lives of testimony, that could be meaningful to both Quakers and non-Quakers around them. I recently discovered an amazing document dated 1772, an account of all the yearly, quarterly, and particular meetings of the people called Quakers in North America in the year 1772. It gives us a sense to sort of take a snapshot of Quaker life in 1772 and how they are geographically dispersed, that with about 218 particular meetings, if you look at the organization of annual meetings, how Quakers gathered together on a regular basis, monthly, quarterly, annually. You had 6 annual meetings: Rhode Island, Flushing, which was the meeting for New York, Connecticut, Philadelphia, which was the meeting for Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina. Roughly half of that total is all associated with Philadelphia meeting for Pennsylvania, New Jersey. But how interesting for those of us who study the South to look and see that the Southern meetings are roughly equivalent in size to the Northern meetings. The Quaker community was much stronger than we give it credit for. There was a meeting in Charleston, and I like to use this image to note how there's actually embedded cultural information here. Charleston, and I think there's some Charlestonians among us will completely understand this, Charleston chose to be not associated, to separate itself and not be associated with any of the North Carolina yearly meetings. It was affiliated with London yearly meeting, thank you very much. It corresponded with London directly, thank you very much. And it sent its representatives to London, thank you very much. They did not need to go to Philadelphia and certainly not to Pasquotank County. Likewise, as Quakers began migrating down the Great Wagon Road, what I think is so interesting in this organizational structure is that when Quaker meetings begin to be set up in western Maryland and in the Shenandoah Valley, organizationally, they do not affiliate with the Maryland or the Virginia yearly meetings. They become organizationally simply an extension of Philadelphia yearly meeting, which has all the cultural implications of saying, these are transplanted Pennsylvanians. This is Pennsylvania culture moving down the Great Wagon Road. And it's only by the time you get into North Carolina that there is such a distance with the Great Wagon Road migrants that now North Carolina yearly meeting, headquartered in the East, has to recognize that its Piedmont congregations, and they emerge in North Carolina yearly meeting, which creates a dichotomy, a conversation, some division in those early decades of the mid-18th century in this migratory pattern that is very different from what Virginia and Maryland yearly meetings clinging to the early eastern coastal areas experienced. Now, understanding the Quaker contribution to Southern material culture, really we owe a debt of gratitude to John Bivens. He was the man who came here to MESDA in the 70s and 80s, who in his book on the furniture of coastal North Carolina talked about Thomas White and his career as a cabinet maker in Perquimans County in eastern North Carolina. He published the critical article that offered the early attribution of a Piedmont, North Carolina group to Jesse Needham, identifying it as a school of furniture that had very strong Quaker associations and affiliations in terms of the provenance of the pieces that were found. And today that's hard for us to always understand, because if we go back to the Fry-Jefferson map of that section of eastern North Carolina and Virginia and look at the Quaker population that was there in the period and look at it today, there are only 3 surviving meetings from that early period that still exist today, 1 in Virginia and 2 in North Carolina. But if we can take that information from that 1772 listing and repopulate that area, it's a completely different picture. The Quakers were a very active presence in the landscape in a way that we don't always fully recognize. Now, with many of this afternoon, I talked about the impact of that with something like the Southampton County Chair Group, a group that simply lived in the MESDA Research Center as an identified grouping based on common characteristics, common retrieval histories, focused primarily in Southampton County, Virginia, but spreading out into Southside Virginia more broadly, and then occasionally showing up oddly in Perquimans County, North Carolina. But when we took the best set of chairs in that group in the MESDA collection and ran its provenance, it actually went back to this family Pretlow, and an early Quaker, Thomas Pretlow, and his wife, who lived in Surry County, Virginia, and a family that then broadly disseminated throughout Southside Virginia. And if we took the name Pretlow and ran it through the MESDA Craftsman database, as I said this afternoon, there was an explosion. The Pretlows were very active craftsmen and woodworkers, and Samuel Pretlow was a very active cabinet maker working in Surry County, and suddenly we can actually realize this is a Quaker product. We could do the same with this chair and run its history back to a man by the name of John Cornwall, who was also in the MESDA Craftsman database and very active as a cabinet maker and as a woodworker. And then really come to the determination that John Cornwall and Samuel Pretlow are the Southampton County Chair Group. And this doesn't have to be an anonymous furniture grouping anymore, but we can really understand it and its retrieval history and what these chairs have to tell us. But in order to do that, we have to go back and reconnect with the Quaker presence that was on the landscape in that area in the 18th century. So there's so much that we can learn by understanding the Quaker presence in that early southern landscape, in the landscape of early North America, and those migratory patterns of how they moved and how that changed things. Part of what I hope we might come to terms with over the course of all these lectures and this study is when we think about the Goddards and the Townsends, the Thomas Afflecks, the Thomas Whites, why is a significant quantity of the really great early American furniture made by these Quaker cabinet makers? Is there a common Quaker aesthetic that is uniting them transatlantically up and down the eastern seaboard? Or rather, is there a common Quaker ethic, a work ethic, an attitude that is embodied in each Quaker craftsman, no matter where they happen to be located, or what their own unique regional cultural influences might happen to be? Hopefully, we'll leave this program with some better understanding of these themes. There's